Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Unstoppable Dad Project. Appreciate you joining me here on this podcast for another week. Before I get into today's topic, please make sure you're subscribed on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. Apple, Spotify, Google, you will find the podcast on all the great podcast platforms. But by you clicking subscribe, it helps get the podcast into the ears of more people like yourself and helps us continue to grow this podcast as per the amazing growth that it has seen over the last couple of years. So if you find some value from this, please make sure you're subscribed. If the platform allows you to leave a 5-star review, please go ahead and do so. And I appreciate each and every single one of you for the support. This week, I'm going to talk about injuries. It's been a little while since I've done a podcast on injuries. Now, if you have listened to the previous podcasts I've done on injuries, the last one I actually covered off was in January. I did go back and I did check that. So it has been a little while. We're looking at almost 12 months since the last one that I've done. But if you have listened to those podcasts, I'm probably going to rehash over some familiar material here. But it's always nice to get a reminder when it comes to injuries, because at the end of the day, I believe that being injured, getting hurt, if you live an active life, unfortunately, it's going to be part of that. One of the reasons I train, and one of the reasons a lot of people that I coach continue to train and continue to do some form of physical activity, is to lessen the reoccurrence of those injuries. And not only lessen the reoccurrence of those injuries, but lessen the severity of those injuries. And what I find with a lot of people that I coach, and I've got a very broad spectrum of people that I coach. I've got people in their teenage years who are young hard chargers who are trying to get better at their sport, all the way through to I have some people that are actually in their late 50s and early 60s who are literally training to prolong their quality of life. And some of those people that are in their older years, they have a lot of pre-existing injuries that have built up over the years as a result of living a great life. And when they're training, we have to deal with some of those injuries reoccurring. But the biggest thing and the biggest piece of feedback that I get from a lot of those people when we are dealing with almost some chronic injuries is, number one, the injuries don't reoccur as often when they are doing structured training. And then number two, in the times where they do reoccur, it's not taking them as long to recover from them. They're usually good to go a day or two later. But then the other thing that feeds into that, and probably the real topic of today's podcast, is I believe one of the reasons that those injuries are not taking as long to heal up or for them to get over is because they are moving more. And I do genuinely believe that in almost all contexts, when you get an injury, stopping moving is not the answer. Again, you're probably sick of me saying this for those of you that listen to the podcast each week. This is obviously going to be very context dependent. There are going to be certain injuries in certain times and certain periods in life where maybe you need to take a couple of days or you need to take a couple of weeks off. This is not a completely blanket statement where everyone has to and everyone doesn't. But in my experience, when it comes to, let's say, any muscular or ligament type injuries, taking time off for me and what I've observed can be more detrimental than it can be beneficial. Now, a couple of things from the point of view of making sure you're continuing to move, you need to be aware of, right? Like you can't just, let's say you've injured yourself doing a particular activity and that injury is relatively severe, on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe it's a 5. So it doesn't necessarily completely affect other aspects of your life, but it does minorly affect other aspects of your life. It's not going to require surgery or intensive rehab, but like it's to the point where it's affecting daily life, but not a whole bunch, right? And you've done it doing a particular activity. Jumping back in and doing that activity the next day is probably not the smartest thing to do. So don't misconstrue what I'm saying here when I say stopping moving is not the answer. if you've hurt yourself doing something, jumping back in and doing that activity is not necessarily the answer to get over your injury. But movement can help with the injury. And I've had an instance this week, which is a pretty common thing that has happened all the way through the last 15 years of coaching, where I've had a client who has hurt themselves. They've hurt themselves doing a sport that we were helping them train for, and didn't tell me that they were nursing this injury. I observed that they weren't completing their sessions in the time that they normally do, so I've reached out to make sure things are going okay. And as a result, we've got the feedback. We've gone back and forth, found out that this particular person was nursing a bit of lower back niggle, bit of lower back soreness. And anyway, so kind of ascertained what was going on, the symptoms they were presenting with, and decided that I said to him, look, I'm going to put a very, very light session in the calendar for you so that you can complete it. Did that, and almost instantaneously got the feedback from them after they'd completed that session that they had started to feel a little bit better. And that for me was just a reminder that for a lot of people, when they are injured, stopping moving is not the answer. Now, what did we look at when, in this particular case, when I was programming something? Well, firstly, I wanted to make sure that whatever I was programming for them was addressing what the issue was. So for this particular person, we were dealing with some lower back stuff. So generally, not all the time, but we started off with looking at kind of the hip area. So looking at making sure that we were doing some glute releases, some couch stretches, and really trying to get the hips mobilized and moving. And then from there, moving into some very light strengthening movements, engagement movements to get the midline working, to get the glutes working, hamstrings, and try and really get everything moving in the right direction again. So we were very selective about the movements we did, and not only just the movements we're doing, but I was also very selective about the volume that I was doing with that person, because I couldn't see them in person, and I couldn't read whether they were getting pain from a particular movement or not. I started on the side of caution and went very, very light with what we were programming. So we were also very smart about the volume. And that was the two of the biggest things when we look at that. And then from there, obviously we had a plan. This is a plan and a template that I have kind of started off with a lot of people over the years to be able to help them to come back from a very similar thing that this person was experiencing. And then once we've done the first session and I've got that feedback from them that they didn't experience any pain throughout the movement, they were able to complete the session successfully. And in this instance, and it doesn't happen all the time that you feel immediately better afterwards. Sometimes you don't feel any worse, but you don't feel any better either. But in this instance, they felt better. So we'd got feedback that, hey, this was actually helping what they were doing. So then when we started to look at what we were going to do next, we were just building slowly. So what I mean by that is we didn't have to reinvent the wheel from what we did in that first session. We actually just added in couple of extra reps, potentially an extra round of the different movements that we were doing. So we just upped the volume slightly, not very much, but just a little bit, to try and build that capacity from that starting point of where they were with their injury. And then what we will do over the coming weeks is we will just continue to build back slowly until we get to the point that they were pre-injury. Now, some people are going to be able to build quicker than others, based off a whole multitude of factors. It can be their injury history, like how many times this injury has been reoccurring, their age, their training history. All these things are going to matter as to how quickly we're able to build them back up. Some people, it may only be a matter of a week. They come in, they get an issue. We modify the program for a little bit. We address the underlying cause, and they're back to where they were a week later. Other people, it may be a process of a couple of weeks. Injury severity is also another thing that matters when it comes to this. Like if it's a minor back niggle, it might just be that we back off for a week, we're selective about the movements and we're smart with the volume, and we're following that plan, but we are only dialing it back say we were training at a 6, we're only dialing it back to, say, a 3, and then the week after we're able to dial it back up to the 6. Whereas other people, if it's quite a severe injury, we may need to dial it all the way back to the 1, and we may need to actually sit on 1 for a few weeks before we move to 2, and then sit on 2 for a few weeks before we move to 3, and so on and so forth. So even within these guidelines that I'm talking about, there is still nuance based off the context and based off what is happening to that person at the time. But all in all, the biggest thing that I've noticed is do not stop moving when you're injured. Okay, there may be a period where you need to take a day or 2 off just to kind of get ahead of things and let everything settle down, let the inflammation settle down, and not only that, actually truly understand what you're dealing with. Sometimes that's needed, just a couple of days off, but taking extended periods off for injury, from what I've observed, not only doesn't help someone recover from it physically, but mentally, it can be very, very draining for the person because they're not able to complete things that they were able to do post-injury. And part of coming back from injury, there is a big mental element to that. And the stopping of movement or the stopping of doing something, for me personally, and for the people that I've coached over the years, I believe has a negative mental impact on everything. It can feed into other areas of life, but more importantly, the consistency that they've potentially built up until the point where they get hurt then becomes harder to regain because they're constantly fighting this battle in between the years of, oh, I'm hurt, and I've taken this extra time off, and then it becomes harder and harder to come back, and then sometimes falls in a heap for years until they get the courage or until they kind of get a kickstart or a jump start to go, all right, I need to get back to it now. Whereas if over that period, they took the time off as they needed, but they were very measured with their approach on continuing to keep moving, they don't have that long hiatus from something that they enjoy. And that's the other mental aspect of it, not just overcoming the injury, but if you're having to stop something that you enjoy doing, that is 100% going to feed into other areas of life and how you not only other areas of life, but how you feel about yourself. So stopping moving for mine is generally not the answer whenever you're injured. Again, it is always very context dependent. Now, just to recap over what I've gone through on this episode and some of the guidelines that you need to think about if you are experiencing an injury and let's say you are completely stopped and you want to do something, here are the kind of, I guess, 5 points that I would really make sure that I'm assessing. Number 1, be selective about the movements that you're doing. You want to try, especially in the early stages, to select movements that are going to cause you no pain or very minimal amount of discomfort. That's number 1. So be selective about the movements. Number 2, be smart about the volume that you're doing. In more instances, when you're coming back from injury, more isn't always better. Okay, so don't try and load yourself up with unnecessary volume if you are experiencing an injury or just in general. This is one thing for a lot of people when it comes to training. I'm digressing a little bit, but you do not need to do more in order for it to be better for you. Okay, yes, if you train more, sometimes the result that you want is going to happen quicker. However, in some instances, actually in a lot of instances and a lot of people that I've talked about, more is not always necessarily better. You need to be smart about the volume that you do and be very selective about the movements that you're doing and then the volume that's being programmed within those movements. Number 3 is have a plan. You've heard me say this a lot when it's come to training for whatever. Training to come back from injuries is exactly the same. In fact, it's probably even more important when you are coming back from injury. Having somebody who knows what they're doing, write you a plan where they are measuring out those sets and reps and they're understanding and they're getting feedback from you about what's happening and how you're responding to it, and then they're adjusting the program based off that feedback, is going to be the quickest way to get you back to doing what you want quickly. I said quickly twice, but you get the point. Having the plan, even though it's number 3 on the list, I actually believe that it should be number 1, because doing that when you're coming back from injury is really, really going to be something that is going to help you an infinite amount. Number 4 is build slowly. So this is number 4, but it is very context dependent, because it will depend on injury severity and a whole bunch of other factors that I've gone through before. But if it is a rather severe injury, or it's a relatively debilitating injury, you need to build back slowly. You're not going to be able to take big steps to get back to where you were, or really big jumps, because if you do run the risk of re-injury or causing yourself a different injury as a result of the first injury not being healed. And the last thing, and this is something I haven't said on this podcast yet, is have something to work towards. Rehabbing from injury, especially if it's a severe one or you're coming back from surgery, can be extremely mentally taxing. So you need to have something extremely clearly defined for you to work towards, which is going to help you get through those days where you have a lot of self-doubt, or those days where you don't want to do the movements or just the sessions that are programmed for you. Having that thing to work towards, that event that you're trying to get back to, that sport that you're trying to get back to, just having the goalposts in front of you and reminding yourself on those tough days when you are trying to rehab the injury is just something that is so important. You need to have, and it doesn't matter whether it's injury or not. You need to have a goal. You need to have something that you're working towards, because in life, most of the time, you're probably not going to be as motivated as you think you're going to be when you're working towards something. So making sure that why and what you're working towards is stronger than the excuses that you're going to give yourself is very, very important. And it's even more so when you are trying to come back from injury. If you don't have something that is going to be more important than the voice that is going to come inside your head that's going to tell you it's okay to take a day off, it's okay to not do this today, it's okay to shortcut these reps, then it can make coming back from injury pretty hard. And it doesn't have to be a sport. It can be just to go and run around with your kids or something along those lines. So hopefully you got some value out of what it is I've gone through. Let me know what your thoughts are on injuries, or if you are dealing with something and you would like some help. Obviously, this is my background. This is something that I've helped people with for the last 15 years. There's a link in the show notes where you can book in a time, and I will jump on a call with you, and we will do a free assessment on your particular set of circumstances, and I will give you some actionable steps that you can take after the call to get started and get you moving back in the right direction. And if you're a good fit and if what I offer is going to help out, we can obviously talk about the paid programs from there. But to start off with, it is just about hopefully setting you off on the right direction to get you back moving and get you back doing what you love. So if you are injured, don't ever stop moving. Get some help from somebody who knows what they're doing. Take care, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.